Well, today we're welcoming John Connolly. And John, hi.
It's very nice to be back, Doris. Thank you for having me.
Well, after writing 30 best-selling adult mysteries and thrillers, you return this time with an upside-down fairy tale titled The Land of Lost Things. And it's a long-awaited sequel to The Book of Lost Things, which was released in 2007.
Hmm.
So tell us a little bit about what the storyline is on this new book.
Well, it's about a young single mother named Ceres who has one of those awful moments that parental nightmare moments, where she's crossing the road with her daughter and her daughter's hand slips her grasp. And before she can get to the daughter, the daughter is hit by a car and is rendered comatose, essentially rendered unresponsive. And Ceres enters that phase that a parent with a sick child, a very sick child, does, where your life revolves around pilgrimages to hospital beds and dealings with doctors, and her work falls away and her friendships fall away. And the child is taken to a care facility on the grounds, and on the grounds is an old house that used to be lived in by a writer. And Ceres gradually gets drawn to this house and drawn into a world that's really influenced by the folklore that her father loved and the folklore that she grew up with. If the first book was about fairy tales, this is more about folklore and the idea. There was a very interesting pamphlet written, I think, in the 17th century in England, called The Secret Commonwealth, by a preacher. And he was very interested in the lore of England, the idea that there was almost like a pre-existing race and a history below the earth. And all of that feeds into the book. So if the first book was about childhood and adolescence, this is a book about parenthood, about being a parent, and particularly being a mother, because the crime writer Ross MacDonald once said that it's much more interesting to come at a target, to not aim directly at the target, to come at it from an angle. And I think that's what fiction writers often do. So rather than write about fatherhood, I wrote about motherhood. I think that bond between a mother and her child is very different, from my own experience, than the bond between father and child, and so that became a way of exploring those themes.
And then she enters an imaginary world of
Well,
tree
you see,
spirits.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure it is imaginary. That's one of the questions when the Book of Lost Things came out.
Right,
The Book of Lost Things was written for adults, but it was
right.
a book that teenagers read in a completely different way. It was the first time I'd had that experience where I wrote a book thinking of one constituency and finding that another was reading it completely differently. Because for teenagers, especially those who had lost a parent, the book was completely visceral to them, and immediate. But they would often ask the question, is the world real or not? And I would fudge it slightly by pointing to one of the epigraphs at the start of the book, which says that Picasso said that everything you can imagine is real. But I think the world that she enters has a kind of independent reality to it. I think it's a psychological landscape, but I also think it's a physical one now. I think it has a kind of reality to it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes it, it's a world that responds to the emotions of the people who enter it. You bring all your baggage into it. And in a way, that's a reflection of the real world. You
Mhm.
step out your door and you bring all your fears and your loves and your hopes and your expectations with you. And they impact upon the world and the way the world reacts to you. So in that sense, the world in the book is not that far removed from the real world.
No, no. As a matter of fact, I think it's very real in many senses of the word. It's very real, but it's also kind of layered into between, for me, reading the book, between the imagination and reality, and
Yeah.
the two seem to meld.
The
But
blend, yeah. I've always been interested in that idea, even in the Parker novels, in liminal zones. Those
yeah,
places where I suppose that's where the supernatural element in the Parker books comes from. That edge where you feel one. It's almost like the gray part of a Venn diagram where two worlds or two
yeah,
realities cross. And I've always found that an interesting place to explore.
yeah. Well, and this book explores that very well. This is a story about stories and their importance to us. Why should we care about stories?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, there are a lot of people who don't. that the majority of people don't read at all, and that a handful of people read an awful lot of books. Um, I think stories are a way of understanding the world and understanding ourselves. I mean, sometimes fiction writers fall back on that thing of, the pleasure for a reader is opening a book and thinking, well, I've always looked at the world that way, but I would never have expressed it in those terms, or I feel that point of connection between the writer and the reader. And that's lovely. In that sense, that's one of the things fiction does for us. Sometimes I think it's more interesting when we read a book and think, I've never thought of that. Or I would never have accepted that, or I would never have looked at the world in that way, and forces us to alter our conception of the world and other people. I think that's really interesting. That's why I get very frustrated when occasionally readers will write to me, and they are almost without exception American readers, and will object to what they perceive as I suppose they'd call it a liberal bias in my books. I just look upon it as kindness, and I grew up in a Catholic household, and I've always thought that even if you're not a Christian, the Ten Commandments seem like a pretty good way to live your life, and actually you could kind of summarize everything as just don't be a jackass. Um, but they will often say, well, I don't want to pick up a book and listen to the writer's opinions on things. And I always find that slightly odd. What they generally mean is that I don't want to read opinions that I don't agree with. That's what the real code is. But also, why would we not want to read fiction that shows us a different perspective on the world? Why would we read just to have our own biases confirmed or our own beliefs confirmed? Another facet of the Land of Lost Things is when I've been doing events, I've been reading out an email that somebody sent to me a few years back complaining that I used obscure words in my books. And he occasionally had to reach for a dictionary, which he really objected to. And in one sense, the Land of Lost Things is also a riposte to that, because it's a book. I think if you're a writer, you should be in love with the possibilities of words and the beauty of them. And so every chapter begins with an obscure or interesting word, often from Anglo-Saxon, but occasionally from Middle English, Cornish, Gaelic. I think there's even a Japanese word in there. And they're there because the words and the concepts they encapsulate are just beautiful. The first word in the book is utkara. And utkara is the Anglo-Saxon word for that feeling when you wake up in the dead of night with a sense of dread, that unease that you have. And there's one particular one, I think because people said, have you got a favorite? And there's one called Hiao feather. And that literally translates as shelter feather. And again, it's an old Anglo-Saxon word. And it's a name for the gesture of putting your arm around someone to console them. It's such a beautiful, beautiful word.
Beautiful.
And so I think if you're a writer, you should be in love with words, and you should be in love with the possibilities of them.
And I think you said there's no such thing as a wrong book.
No, I don't think there's. You can pick up the right book at the wrong time, I think. And that certainly has happened to me. I mean, it took me 3 tries to read Bleak House by Charles Dickens, and I think eventually I had to take it on a plane to South Africa with me as the only book I had to do that thing of kind of, because it's interesting when you pick up 19th century fiction, and Bleak House, I think, maybe it's my favorite novel in English, I think. It takes a little while for your brain to rewire itself occasionally. The machinery needs to alter. And so you find that it takes you about 20 or 30 pages to get into something like Dickens or Middlemarch, because it's unfamiliar reading. The readers have had the same experience. I wrote a book called He a couple of years back, which is a book about Stan Laurel. And it was very much a piece of experimental literary fiction. It had a very particular aesthetic. And almost without exception, readers have said it took me about 40 pages. And then it clicked. Something in me clicked. And I got okay. And the book was exact. And that's why I distrust people who say, if the book hasn't gripped me within 40 pages, I'd throw it away. Well, actually, sometimes the flaw lies with you. It may take you that amount of time for your brain to kind of think, okay, I see what's being done here. And then it reworks itself to accommodate what the writer is trying to do.
Right.
Because I've never underestimated the intelligence of readers. Stupid people don't read books. It's one of the great signs of a stupid person. So, it's almost like those frogs in the Amazon rainforest that are brightly colored. It's nature's way of saying stay away. And generally people who read books are smart, and they will give you a certain amount of leeway. And as a reader, I like being tested slightly. I don't want to just, not all the time. I used to love Robert B. Parker's books, and I don't think Robert B. Parker has used a new word since 1980. And yet the books were, the pleasure was encountering the characters and the familiarity of the rhythms of it, and that's lovely too. But I do occasionally like to pick up a book and find that I'm being challenged. I think that's part of the pleasure of being a reader.
Yes, yes. Well, we see David as a continuing character in the new book, and you never wanted to write a sequel to the Book of Lost Things.
No,
Why?
I
Why did
felt I felt that it was a complete book in itself. It didn't require a sequel. And I still think that. I don't think that The Land of Lost Things is quite a sequel to it. It moves in the same world. But that first book was hugely personal to me. A lot of it was my childhood, but again, in that Ross MacDonald way, not aiming directly at it, but coming at it from an angle. And I realized during lockdown, I was trying to write a film script for it, and I had to disassemble the Book of Lost Things and reassemble it. And it clicked something in me because I realized I'd reached a different stage of my life. I have become, through some miracle or curse, the responsible adult in the room. I'm at that stage of middle age where my mother, God love her, she's 90, still living independently at home in the house we grew up in. The house is too big for her. Things go wrong with it. Has all her faculties, but she's frailer than she used to be. So I am not quite a parent to her, but I'm looking after her in a way that she would have looked after me at one point. I have two sons. I worry about them. They live abroad. I have family that I have to look issues with my family, and I realized I was living my life at a low level hum of worry. I'm at that stage where my phone. I hate having to take my phone to bed with me, and it's got do not disturb on it. But there are two or three numbers that will come through, and if that phone rings during the night, it's not going to be because I won the lottery. It's going to not going to be good news. Um, and I suppose I wanted to explore it. I'd become parent to my parent. I'd become parent to my children. I'm parent to another generation within my family. And I realized I wanted to return to that world to look at my life as it is now. I think had I written a sequel to the Book of Lost Things, or tried to write a sequel to it 5 or even 10 years after, I would have just been repeating myself. I hadn't changed enough as a human being to want to go back and look at my life through that prism. And I think if I were ever to write another one, I will write it when I'm old. I will write it when I'm in my 70s, and it will be a book about aging and death. It will be a book about that stage of my life. So
Yes,
really had to have my heart in it. I really had to be something that I felt I needed to do for my own sake.
right.
And that's not a bad reason to write a book.
No, not a bad reason at all. Well, The Land of Lost Things echoes several classic fairy tales. I think I see similarities to The Tin Man from Wizard of Oz and The Three Bears and Alice in Wonderland. Did you consciously intend those subtle references?
Some of them are intentional. Some of them, I mean, none of those things are mentioned explicitly in the book, but as a writer, you're a product of everything that you read. And if you're going back to folklore and fairy tales, the book becomes a product of things that are very old and atavistic, that were there since childhood. And inevitably, they're going to filter into what you do. Um, I mean, some of them are explicit. I've always had a problem with the story of Rapunzel. Even as a child, I remember thinking, wait a minute, so she lets her hair down and this guy climbs up the side of the castle while hanging onto her hair. Are you sure? Are you sure that's how it went? Because that doesn't sound right to me. Um, but more of it, the book, as I said, is more interested in folklore. And
Yes.
there are one or two Irish. I mean, I realized there's a little bit of Irishness crept into it. There's a story we all learn in school called in Irish the Tariacht Diarmida agus Gráine, and it's about a woman essentially who makes a deal with the fairies. And I realized when I was writing one of the stories that the Woodsman tells series that was a version of that story, but I hadn't set out to write a version of it. It sounds quite odd. When you do something like this, you're mining quite deeply. You're digging away at stuff in your unconscious, and you can be surprised sometimes by what comes out, by what you've stored away from childhood or from adolescence.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'm intrigued by it seems to me that you kind of play a little game with the readers in a way, and that you have that you challenge us to find some hidden history in the stories and the characters, especially if we've read other books of yours. Are you having fun planting clues? Or how do you see that?
No, I don't. I'm not. I don't. I'm not sure if I consciously do that. I find that type of meta writing. I can get a bit annoyed by it. I think.
Okay.
So I mean, there is in it. What the issue was that at some point, the Land of Lost Things had to acknowledge the existence of the Book of Lost Things.
Right.
Book to work, the Book of Lost Things had to exist,
Right.
and in theory, series had to have read it. And that even that I tried to handle as delicately as I could, because otherwise you can fall down all kinds of rabbit holes, and the next thing you know, you're a character in your own book. And at that point, I'd be very tempted to fling my own book against the wall, I would imagine. So I tried to tread quite delicately. I worry about attracting the reader's attention in that way. I think you can tip into a kind of cleverness that can be alienating to the reader, I think, perhaps. That's just, I mean, we can differ on it.
No,
But I worry about doing that. So I try to tread very carefully when I do things like that, perhaps.
well, I think it's very subtle. You know, it's not in your face or anything. It's very subtle, I
Well, thank
think.
God for that.
Well, you write that some types of lunacy are so close to sanity that they're indistinguishable. Um, Tell us a little bit about that. Is that
I suppose, there's a you could say creativity is something like that. That the creative urge, that urge to imagine things that are extraordinary and make them understandable to the reader is a form of madness. Creativity is an odd beast. I mean, I think creative people are, and I think we're all creative in some shape or form, but I think creativity is almost a manifest. It's almost like a channeling of urges that could be very destructive in other ways, I think. When I was younger, one of the things I gave David in the Book of Lost Things was my own. When I was a teenager, I was really appalling OCD. I mean, just so I think I still have, if when I die, they'll look at my skull and they'll find these indentations, because I would literally bang my head against walls. And it was a really difficult period. And I think that's when that disorder manifests itself in adolescence, because I think if you're a particular type of child, you're maybe fearful of the world, and it becomes a way of granting you the illusion of control over things that you're frightened of, or things you can't possibly have control over. You make a deal with the universe. You say that if I perform these little rituals, X won't happen. And it becomes and we grow out of it then. I think I'm surprised when I talk at books how often there will be people in the audience who will have gone through OCD as a child. It's very common. Whether how serious it is, well, that varies. But I think I found a way to sometimes to channel that, which is a form of madness, into the way that I write, in that I'm very reluctant to leave anything unfinished. I don't have any unpublished stories in my drawer. I have no half-finished novels. I have no half-finished short stories. And when I talk to people at signings, one of the things, because I often think people who come to book events are very interested, or people who are listening to this are very interested in the process of writing, or are trying to write. I think that it's something that they would like to do. And what I always tell them is that you have to finish what you start. That's the really difficult thing. I've wanted to throw away. I'm on my 36th book now. Every one of them I've wanted to throw it away after 20,000 words. Every one of them I've lost faith in at that point. And I think that's the natural stage at which the initial enthusiasm about a project wears away. And that's the point at which people will set aside what they're doing and start something else, because they've got that new idea in their heads, or begin doubting whether they can be novelists. And I think that madness that I endured as a child, I found a way to channel that into in that if I start something, I'm very good at psychologically committing to finishing it. And my wife would tell you that if you point me at a hill and tell me that I have to climb it, I'll climb it, no matter how much it hurts me. I'll climb it until I get to the top, because I can't leave the thing unclimbed. And that's a kind of useful way It was a very interesting question, but I think, you with extreme bouts of creativity, you are touching on a kind of madness sometimes. You are
Yes,
trying to formalize something that's very strange and odd
yes.
and not easily categorizable or quantifiable.
I mean, you've written 36 books, approximately 36 books. How in the world do you turn out so much material?
I write very slowly and methodically all the time. I'm very bad at taking time off, and I'm quite good at. I can be writing one book in the morning and I can be editing something in the afternoon because those are different muscles and they use different parts of the brain. Um, and also, I don't have a proper job. I mean, what I do is I write, and I'm very fortunate that I'm able to do that, and that's how I support my family. And so, um, I'm quite methodical about it and quite organized and quite disciplined. But I don't write rapidly. I don't write quickly. I write slowly, but I write slowly all the time. I'm a tortoise. Uh, but I get there. I get there in the end.
You've said throughout your career that you feel doubts about every story that you write. Is that still true after all of your success?
Yeah, it becomes more profound as you go on because you start thinking that actually this may be the one where you go wrong, or this may be the one where the inspiration leaches out of you. Um, there's always a fear because it's I don't teach writing because I don't quite understand it. Um, and I'm not good at trying to explain processes. Um, and I think you realize as you get older just how fragile that this, call it whatever you want, this ability or this gift that you have or this talent is. And you it just seems like the law of averages suggests that the longer you go on, the more likely you are to make a mistake somewhere along the line, I think. Um, and so, yeah, so I mean, I know that doubt is part of the process, and I try to explain that to people who want to write, that it just is. Anybody who doesn't experience doubt, probably what they're writing isn't very good.
Right,
Um, and
right.
doubt is, doubt is the thing that makes you try harder, and doubt is the thing that makes you, do that extra draft or go that extra length with it. But it's a very much a double-edged sword. And living it and trying to accommodate it into a creative life is one of the challenges, I suppose, and it's an ongoing one.
Is getting published now, especially in the United States, more difficult than it has been?
I don't know really. I mean I'm a little bit out of the loop in the sense that thankfully I've had the same publisher for in England and the UK, England and the US since I started, and the same editors. I'm very unusual, I think, in that I don't like moving around, and I've never had an argument with them. Um, but I think it was always difficult to be published. I
Yeah,
think it was always, there was always it was always going to be a struggle. Maybe, and I want to tread carefully here, but I think I sometimes feel that in the UK and Ireland it's a little bit more civilized than in
yeah,
the US.
I
I think
believe.
in the US it's a little bit more ruthless and it can be harder to cut through those layers. Um, there are obviously more outlets than there were before in some ways. I mean, internet publishing has changed the nature of the beast a little bit. Um, but ultimately, I think most people, even people who are, who are proselytizers for self-publishing, there's a little part of them that would like the book to be published with a penguin on the spine. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
That
Yes.
imprimatur, that objective, where a whole group of people look at what you do and objectively say, actually, we think this is worth getting behind. But it's I think it was always difficult, and I don't think that's ever going to change. I think maybe there's a sense of sometimes there's more of a sense of entitlement now. I think the idea that I should be published, that I have the right to be published, and that these
Wow.
people, this awful word gatekeepers, these people are standing in my way. And actually, the truth of publishing is that the industry is always looking for things to publish. It's a huge machine that needs to be fed, and it's always looking for new. I'm not interesting. I've been around too long to be interesting. Most people know my story and they're familiar with what I, generally speaking, apart from the little oddities that I do, are familiar with what I write. the new writer coming in, this person that no one has ever read before, or no one's ever heard before, with this new story and this new way of looking at the world. Editors and publishers and agents are always looking for them, and they're always trying to publish work they can be proud of. People in publishing
Yes.
don't get paid a great deal of money. The pleasure for most of them is getting behind a book that everybody believed in, that everybody loved, and getting it into the hands of other people. And so this idea that people are trying to stop you from being published, that's not the case. What they want to do is publish something that they can all stand over and say, yes, we all talk. And the weird thing about the industry is that, as we found out during the case about Simon and Schuster being bought, who are my own publishers, that actually 90% of books don't make any money.
Right.
That's the nature of the beast. And 5% kind of cover their costs, and then 5% make enough money that that money can be plowed back into new writers. And it's a very holistic model. And it's why I've never wanted to, even when there was a period a decade ago when some of the big internet giants were, pushing people to move, and the idea that you could keep all your money and they just take a portion of it. I like the idea that the fact that I make a profit means that that money goes back into publishing other writers.
Yeah.
The publishing
Yes.
books that people love that might not make a lot of money, but the world is not going to be poorer for having more books in the world.
Right.
So
Well,
I get quite annoyed. That sentiment time with the sense that people are trying to block my destiny. I don't buy that. That's never been the case. The industry desperately wants to publish good work.
that's wonderful. What about film? Have you? I heard you say you were working on a script, I think.
Only because no one had ever managed to write a script of the Book of Lost Things. They could only ever get to the outline, and then they gave up. And I thought, well, maybe I can solve the problem. And I mean, I did manage to write a script, but then we just found that there were more problems, and that there's a lot more in it than there appears to be. And so it's not really suited to film. It may be better suited to television. And at that point, I just walked away because it was taking up too much time. I have nothing to do with it. There are various books that are moving close to being filmed or made for television, but honestly, Doris, I could be dead in the ground before they appear on the screen, and my kids will dig up my skull and put it on the couch beside them and say, it's just like he's been here, it's just like, it's what he would have wanted, these are out of my hands. It's good that it takes me enough time to write books without worrying about it.
Yes.
And anyway, I'm not sure. I don't really need a yacht. I get seasick and I can't wear white pants. So,
What will you write about next? Will it be a fantasy or a thriller or?
Well, no. The next Parker book has been delivered, and that will be out next May. I think simultaneously again in the US and the UK. And I have another volume of nocturne short stories pretty much done, and I'm working on a book set against the backdrop of the televising of the Watergate hearings. Because I live in fear of repeating myself. I'm so anxious not to do that. I think it frustrates my poor old publishers sometimes, because the way to achieve commercial success is essentially to write a version of the same book every year. Your publishers won't complain, your readers won't complain, booksellers won't complain. The public gets the latest Inspector Megan's mystery, and they're happy because they got to spend time with the character. But it's a way of calcifying as a writer.
Yes.
You cannot develop in any way, and ultimately you'll end up shortchanging your readers. They'll just have read what you've done before. And so I try every second book, I try to do something a little bit different, and even if it fails, you learn something from failing. I mean, my publishers have to be very tolerant, and I meet them halfway. I'm not going to get paid as much for a Parker book as for Shadow Voices, the big 1,100-page book I wrote on genre fiction. But I learn as much from doing that, and I develop more as a writer from doing it. And like I said, I've been very fortunate with my publishers. They have been, and that's why like I said, to go back to that question, I get quite angry about people talking about gatekeepers and being dismissive. I have found only that people have wanted me to develop as a writer, and they've given me the space to do that. I've been very lucky in the publishers I've found.
Well, and the publishers are lucky to have you.
Thank you.
You dedicate your book to Jenny and a few others. Tell me about the people that you dedicated the book
Well,
to.
the first book was dedicated to Jenny and the kids. We were married at that stage, and And it seemed just proper to dedicate the next book to this as well. But also that one of my kids is now married, and the other is very settled with his girlfriend, and so it made sense to dedicate it to them as again. But also somebody once said that you reach a certain age when you're old enough to appreciate fairy tales again,
Yes.
not just for children, that they're for adults. And I think they've reached that age as well where they can look at them and look at them as with the book in a slightly different way. So it seemed appropriate.
I love the one of the quotes in the book. The Crooked Man says, "A book is like a house, and stories are the souls that inhabit it."
Yeah,
Yeah.
I get irritated. There's quite a famous literary writer in Ireland who objects to being called a storyteller. And I always think, well, then maybe you shouldn't have got into the business of fiction. No, I just think that it kind of comes with the territory a little bit, that dismissiveness. But then he hates genre fiction as well. So I suppose it's a psychological ailment that he has.
Okay, well, John Connolly, many thanks for talking with you today.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Doris, as always. Thank you very much for your kindness and patience.